in her day. Her mom brought her to the port of Baltimore, put her on a train, and they linked up with my grandfather in East St. Louis, Illinois. Upstairs in my office is my mother's naturalization certificate. It's proudly displayed because I want people to know who I am and where I came from. It's my story, it's my family story, but it's America's story. That the son of an immigrant could be standing on the floor of the United States Senate representing the great state of Illinois and speaking to the next generation of immigrants to America and the difference they can make. This is our opportunity. We know that America will be a stronger and better nation when we do it. Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor. Suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator Durbin, who we just saw on the Senate floor, is quoted in a story in The Hill saying that it would be a big mistake to chase 70 or more votes on immigration reform in the Senate. And in another story in The Hill, one of the Gang of Eight who wrote the bill, Senator Graham, predicts breakthrough passage of immigration bill with over 70 votes, saying that he's never been more optimistic about it. 60 votes are needed for the immigration bill to pass in the Senate, and Senate Leader Reid says he hopes to finish work on the legislation before the July 4th recess.
Mr. President,
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask that the quorum call be dispensed with.
Without objection.
Mr. President, last week I gave remarks on the floor that pointed out that promises made that the immigration bill before us was a significant move towards merit-based immigration and away from chain immigration. I dealt with that subject. I'm not aware that any of my comments have fundamentally been disputed. The fact is that of the 30 million people who will be given legal status as an immigrant on a pathway to citizenship over the next 10 years, that 30 million is 3 times the current legal flow of 1 million a year, which would be 10 million a year. It would triple the number of people given, put on a path to permanent legal residence and citizenship. Only 2.5 million of those would be admitted under this new, small, actually weak, merit-based section of the bill. This is nowhere close to the truly effective and popular merit-based immigration system that Canada adopted a decade, maybe more ago, and which is being followed and adopted in other developed countries around the world. Evidence has also been introduced that non-immigrant guest workers, that is, those who come not for immigration to be a citizen and be permanent, but to come and work for a period in return, that group of workers will double under the legislation that's before us, over current law. So all of this at a time of persistently high unemployment and when virtually all serious academics, economic experts agree that such a huge flow will depress wages of our middle-class workers and increase unemployment. Politicians blithely claim otherwise, but Professor Borjas at Harvard and the Federal Reserve in Atlanta and others have studied this, and they show otherwise with in-depth economic research. So there's a long list of other promises. The reason I raise this is because these were promises, that we're going to improve the working conditions of Americans. We're going to shift to a merit-based system. That's not correct. And there are other promises, and I've made a speech and others have, that have clearly demonstrated the triggers in the bill don't work. The triggers are supposed to say, well, you don't get legal status or you don't get green card status until these law enforcement issues are fixed, until the illegality is fixed. And the triggers are ineffective. That's been documented. It's really not disputable, in my opinion. All the Secretary of Homeland Security has to do is to submit a plan that she says will work, does not require any fencing or any other action specifically, and she gets to determine whether or not it's working. If it doesn't meet the standards according to the Secretary, then a Board of Commission is established, but the Board of Commission has no power. It can only issue a report, and it disbands in 30 days. So these promises that we have a very tough plan that's guaranteed through a series of triggers is not so. And today I'll talk about the DACA program and how that's been undermined law enforcement. So surely we can agree that congressional legislation is more than a salesmanship, it's more than puffing, it's more than promises. Surely it represents a bill, and a bill that must be read. The words of legislation are not a mere vision designed to touch our hearts. It's not something that the sponsors can come in and say, we believe the American people are correct, they want A, B, C, and D, and we've got a bill that does it, and then nobody reads the bill to determine whether or not it does it. So that's what I've been trying to do. Congress and the good American people do want to solve our immigration problems and the problems that our politicians and government leaders have messed up for 30 years. American people have pleaded with Congress to fix this system for 30 years. Congress has failed to do so. They continue to promise to do so, but do not. Now, that's the fact. But legislative language is the real thing. Legislation is not a vision. Legislation has power, power to fix our broken system, or power to allow the lawlessness to continue. Thus, it is legislation, not spin, that we will be voting on. A promise made by a gang is of no value if the bill language doesn't produce the result they promise. So that's the rub. That's the problem we're facing. So, presumably, there are ads running this very day which claim to be sponsored by conservative voices, founded by Mr. Zuckerberg of Facebook wealth. No conservative, to my knowledge, featuring Senator Rubio urging the passage of the bill. Indeed, Mr. Zuckerberg apparently created a front group that's on the advertisements, and it says they are called Americans for a Conservative Direction, that purport to be reflective, I suppose, of conservative thinking in America who's running this ad. Well, I think that's a bit odd, and it's odd right now that Senator Rubio, who's still talking to the American people on those ads and to my constituents in Alabama, I suppose, that he's saying all of this on the ad when he's already said the bill is flawed and he can't vote for it in its current circumstances. So I think that bill, that advertisement, ought to be pulled, seems to me. Worse, virtually everything in the ad, especially in the voice-over, not Senator Rubio's voice, but the voice-over is false. It's just not an accurate description of the legislation, what it does, how it will work. It's just not. If it was, I would be intrigued by this legislation and would be interested in thinking it should, it sets forth sort of a framework most Americans would agree would be a basis for immigration reform. So conservatives should be careful, no matter how sincere, in being part of promoting legislation that we don't fully understand or will not do what it claims to do. A commitment to truth is a conservative value. Now, I like all the Gang of Eight members personally. I've worked with them for a number of years, and I really admire Senator Rubio. He's just a fantastic new member of the body. And I understand the goals that they articulate and would support most of those goals. So it's no pleasure for me to raise these uncomfortable points, but at this very minute, the billionaire and his supporters are running these ads promoting legislation as doing something I don't believe it does, and I think we should be working on that. And I know we've had a number of our colleagues, another one of my good friends this weekend pronounce a political doctrine of the death spiral of the Republican Party. And I just got to tell you, we have a lot of people that make political prognostications. But the truth is, who knows what political issues would dominate in 2016 or 2020 or 2030. Mr. President, is there a time agreement at this point?
Each senator has 10 minutes to speak, sir.
Thank you. I didn't realize that. And how much time is left on this side?
Senator has 1 minute.
I thank the chair. Well, the best politics, in my view, is to do the right thing for the right reasons. and to be able to explain what one is doing cogently and honestly to the American people. And then the people will decide. If they don't like your decisions over a period of time, you're out. So be it. Isn't that the way the system is supposed to work? Now, it's not wrong to give a decent respect to the opinions of the American people, to ask what they think about issues and how they react to issues. There's nothing wrong with that. Actually, we should do that. But it's not right to poll a large and complex issue to find out what the people want and then propose legislation that you say fulfills their desires when the legislation doesn't fulfill those desires. Now, that isn't the right thing to do to promote good policy in America. As a matter of fact, polls show that the American people want enforcement before amnesty by a 4-to-1 margin. Polls also show a clear majority actually favor lower legal flow or the same amount of legal flow into our country from immigration. And I thank you, and they do not favor the huge increase of legal flow that's called for in this bill. Mr. President, I thank the Chair for the opportunity to speak, and maybe later we'll be able to talk about some of the difficulties of enforcement on the current law. Thank the Chair, and would yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate the great work that my colleague Senator Durbin and Senator Schumer, Senator Rubio, and others have done on the immigration bill. I'm going to be pleased this week to support their work. But I come to the floor today, as I have most weeks since being sworn in, to talk about the issue that has dominated discussions in my state over the past 6 months, and that's the issue of gun violence. We commemorated last week the 6-month anniversary of the deadly shooting in Sandy Hook, Connecticut, in which 26 and 7-year-olds, first graders, were gunned down, and 6 of their teachers, including as well the gunman and his mother. And a lot of the families came down here last week to continue to lobby both the House and the Senate. And the look on their face is a complicated look. It's clearly, first and foremost, a look of just incalculable grief as these families still try to figure out how to live the first summer of their life without their loved one, whether it be a first grader who would have been heading into second grade, or a mother or a teacher or a brother or sister. But there is also, in combination with this grief, this look of shock. This look of shock that frankly gets worse every time they come down here as they try to understand how this place could stand by and do nothing, absolutely nothing, in the wake of the horror that Newtown, Connecticut has seen. Now, at least we've taken a vote here on the Senate floor, and very much like the description that Senator Durbin gave earlier of his attempt several years ago to pass the DREAM Act, we got 54 votes on the floor of the Senate, and under our draconian and backwards rules, that wasn't enough to get the bill done. But the House hasn't even scheduled a debate on gun violence legislation. Families in Newtown, Connecticut just cannot understand that. They can't understand how senators and House members can look them in the eye, can hear the story of their grief, and do nothing. They certainly can't understand it after almost to the day of the 6-month anniversary, another mass shooting occurred, this time on the other side of the country. And you almost know the story before you hear it. Mass shooting, 4 dead, others wounded. In Newtown, we didn't even have to pick up the paper to know that it was going to be an assault weapon. It was going to be high-capacity magazines, once again. Now, every story is a little bit different, so this one was an assault weapon that was partially handmade. This time it was a lot of ammunition that may not have been used, but it's just a story that gets repeated over and over and over again. Lots of people dead, assault weapon used, high-capacity magazines. And so for those people who say we can't do anything about it, well, we can. We can, because we can keep these dangerous military-style weapons in the hands of law enforcement and people who are hired and trained to shoot these weapons for a living. We can say that 8, 10, 15 rounds is enough, that you don't need 30 rounds in a magazine. You don't need 100 rounds. We can do something about our mental health system to try to reach out and give some help to people who are struggling. But we don't. And that's what's so hard for the families of Newtown to understand. What's additionally hard for them to understand is this number. Since those 28 people were killed in Newtown on December 14th, Mr. President, 5,033 people have died at the hands of gun violence across this country. Now, this chart's a couple days old, so you can probably take down the 33 and add a handful more. And I hope people here have gotten to understand the stories of people like Jack Pinto and Dylan Hockley and Grace McDonald. I hope that people here have come to know the stories of the 20 little boys and girls who we will never know their greatness because they were cut down in their youth. But I want to tell you some other stories about the common, everyday, almost routine gun violence that for some reason we have just decided to live with in this country. And so I'm coming down here every week just to tell you another handful of stories about victims. And today, instead of telling detailed stories about specific victims, I just want to tell you about one weekend in New York City. About 2 weeks ago, the weekend of May 31st to June 2nd was kind of the first truly warm outdoor weekend that we had in the Northeast. And the police in places like New York City and Bridgeport and Hartford, you know, they've come to dread that first real hot summer weekend, because the summers tend to come with a lot of guns and a lot of gun violence and a lot of shootings in places that maybe not a lot of Americans are used to, living in the safety and security of their neighborhoods. But let me tell you what happened on that one weekend in one city of New York, New York. That weekend, 25 people were shot over the course of 48 hours. 6 people were killed over one single weekend in New York City. It started with Ivan Martinez, 21 years old, who was approached at about 3:25 a.m. on Friday night by a 20-year-old gunman and a woman in the Bronx. The gunman shot Martinez once in the head, then he ran off with the woman. Over the course of the weekend, 12 people were shot in Brooklyn, 8 people were shot in the Bronx, 4 in Queens. It went like this on Sunday night. At 12:10 a.m., a 21-year-old man was shot in the leg. At 2:36 a.m., a 21-year-old man was shot 3 times on East New York Ave in Brooklyn. About an hour later, at 3:30, a 20-year-old man was shot in the leg at Bedford Park in the Bronx. 4:12 a.m. that morning, a 35-year-old man brought himself to Jamaica Hospital with a gunshot wound. At 11:40 a.m., a 15-year-old was shot in the leg and the back. 11:40 a.m., middle of the day on Sunday, a 15-year-old shot in the leg and the back. And then about 3:25, a gunman opened fire at the corner of Bedford and Lenox at Prospect Lefferts Gardens. The carnage in one weekend barely made news across this country. Most people wouldn't know it if I didn't come down to the Senate floor and tell this story. That is what we have come to accept in this country. This represents a dramatic drop in gun violence in New York City. So far, we've had 440 shootings in New York City. That's a 23% reduction from last year. This has been a good year in New York City, and 440 people have been shot. And we do nothing about it here. We can't even bring ourselves to say that criminals shouldn't have guns, that gun trafficking done out of the back of vans on the side streets of the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens should be a crime. We can't even do that on the floor of the Senate. That weekend, maybe the most tragic shooting was one that didn't end up in a death. And that was the shooting of a little girl named Tayloni Marchik. 3 men opened fire in a wild episode that weekend in Brooklyn. People said that it sounded like it was the 4th of July. So many gunshots were going off in this neighborhood. It was likely gang activity, but the consequence of the shooting wasn't a gang member. It was a little 11-year-old girl who was struck through her neck. The bullet lodged in her spine, and though Tayloni lived, she will never walk again. Listen, I grieve every single morning and every single night for the 20 little girls and boys who died in Newtown, Connecticut. And if that's what's prompted us to finally have a serious discussion here on the floor of the Senate and the House about gun violence reform, then so be it. But this is just an average summer weekend in New York. Little girls getting paralyzed, shootings throughout Saturday and Sunday night, people getting shot in the middle of broad daylight on a Sunday afternoon, and we can do something about it. We don't have the power to eliminate gun violence. We can't make bad people stop doing bad things. But we can pass common sense laws like background checks to check if criminals are getting guns or people with serious, dangerous mental illness. We can increase the resources of social workers and psychologists to try to reach some of these kids, to teach them other ways of dealing with their anger than just going and reaching for a gun. We can lock up anybody who takes a bunch of guns from a gun show, throws them into a sack, and goes and sells them to criminals on the streets of New York or Bridgeport or Los Angeles or Chicago. We are not helpless. We have power in this place to do something about the mass shootings in Newtown, the mass shootings in Santa Monica, and the 5,033 people who have died across this country since December 14th in the 6 months since. It's not too late, Mr. President. We have a chance to come back to this floor after immigration, perhaps after the summer. Let cooler heads prevail and allow this body to do something about the scourge of gun violence that so far this place has had no answer for and causes the families of Newtown and the families of these victims to leave this place shaking their heads. I yield the floor. And note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
In a little less than 30 minutes, senators are expected to debate a couple of judicial nominations. Votes on those nominations are expected at 5:30 Eastern. Some news from the Associated Press as we wait for a senator to speak. Senator Bob Corker says he's holding up $75 million in U.S. assistance to Afghanistan until he gets answers from the Obama administration about alleged cash payments from the CIA to Afghan President Ahmed Karzai. Corker, the top Republican on the Senate Financial Relations Committee, and now a senator on the floor.
I think the chair would ask consent that the quorum call be dispensed with.
So ordered.
I had earlier reported on some points and speeches I'd made about some of the promises from the Gang of Eight concerning the legislation they've offered and why they're not fulfilled in their bill. For example, the triggers and the merit-based movement they claim is significant in their legislation. I believe both of those are inaccurate. And today I wanted to point out how government officials are refusing to enforce our current law and the unease that causes all of us, and how this bill does not fix that problem but gives even more power, discretion, and to the political appointees to waive, moderate, get around the enforcement requirements of this new bill that's been put in place, that requirements of enforcement that our bill sponsors say is important and must happen, but the bill does not require it to happen in many different places. So the story that I'll be telling is effective to explain why, despite the pleas from the American people for 30 years, that lawlessness continues to rise in the immigration area, why we now have 30 million people here illegally. Now, Senator Durbin earlier made reference to the DREAM Act that he has worked hard on, and it does present, for the most part, some of the most sympathetic claims for some sort of legalization in the country. The reason that Congress rejected his legislation because it overreached, not because it didn't have a chance if it had been more narrowly drafted, in my opinion, but it did not pass. But in essence, the President did it anyway. The President of the United States just did it anyway. He issued directives to the federal law enforcement officers. You don't enforce this, this, and this, and do it like we tell you to. And that comes from the President to the Secretary of Homeland Security, to John Morton, and all the supervisors, and on down to the officers. The officers are up in arms about this. The ICE officers who enforce these laws have voted no confidence in Mr. John Morton, and I believe today or Friday Mr. Morton announced his resignation after quite a long time of being the center of this controversy. They said no confidence in him. They say basically he spent his time out promoting amnesty, meeting with special interest groups, and not helping them do their job, and basically directing them not to do what the law plainly required them to do, putting them in an untenable position in violation of their oath to follow the law as opposed to following their boss's political directions. And indeed, and amazingly, the law enforcement officers have filed a lawsuit against Secretary Napolitano and Mr. Morton, and they're claiming that they are being forced to violate law. And the judge has allowed this case to go forward, and it's being discussed. It's in court right now. So I've never heard, as a federal prosecutor for nearly 15 years, I've never heard of such a thing, where the officers are suing their supervisors who won't let them follow plain law. And this is the problem we deal with. So over a year ago, as Senator Durbin mentioned earlier, the President implemented a backdoor amnesty for about 1.7 million, Pew estimate, illegal immigrants who are here through a program called the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrives, DACA. So this is a DACA program. He just issued a directive. It covers aliens who entered the country illegally when they were under the age of 16 and not older than 31 as of June 15, 2012. Congress dealt with legislation to that effect and rejected it and did not pass it. According to the published Department of Homeland Security guidelines, each DACA applicant is required to submit biographic and biometric information along with other information to prove that they're eligible for the program. And this U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, USCIS, is to process the applications. And just a little over a year, USCIS has approved an astonishing 291,859 applicants. On May 20th, Kevin Palinkas, president of the National Citizenship and Immigration Council, the union representing the 12,000 USCIS adjudication officers who are supposed to adjudicate these matters, issued a press release reporting, quote, a 99.5% approval rating for all illegal alien applications for legal status filed under the Obama administration's new Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, DACA, policies. He reported a 99.5% approval. He attributed the exceptionally high approval rate to policies instituted by the Department of Homeland Security leadership that essentially made it impossible to make any real effort to eliminate fraud or identify dangerous criminal aliens. You think out of 300,000 applicants, some of them aren't criminals and dangerous? They're not 16 now. Many of them are 30 years of age. I mean, if you have a city of 300,000, aren't there some people in it that are not lawful in their actions? He goes on to say this, quote, Department of Homeland Security and USCIS leadership have intentionally established an application process for DACA applicants that bypasses traditional in-person investigatory interviews with trained USCIS adjudicating officers. These practices were put in place to stop proper screening and enforcement. He's saying the new policies that eliminate the interviews were put in place, quote, to stop proper screening and enforcement and, quote, guarantee that applications will be rubber stamped for approval, a practice that virtually guarantees widespread fraud and places public safety at risk, close quote. That's a pretty gutsy thing to say for a person who works in the Department of Homeland Security about their supervisors. I'm sure they gave great thought to that. This press statement goes on to say this, quote, the attitude of USCIS management, these are the political appointees, is not that the agency serves the American public or the laws of the United States or public safety and national security, but instead that the agency serves illegal aliens and the attorneys that represent them. While we believe in treating all people with respect, we are concerned that this agency, tasked with such a vital security mission, is too greatly influenced by special interest groups to the point that it no longer properly performs its mission, close quote. Now that is a strong statement. And it would be something we should listen to as we evaluate whether or not we need to give more discretion to these supervisors in the future when we pass a new bill, more discretion than is in current law. Mr. Palinkas sent a letter to Congress in June of this year, June 5th, just a few weeks ago, reiterating his concerns in light of S. 744, this 1,000-page bill that we're being asked to vote on. He wrote this about the bill. He said this bill, quote, would lead to the rubber stamping of millions of applications for both amnesty and future admissions, putting the public safety and the taxpayer at risk, close quote. He further stated that, quote, in addition to the impossible time constraints imposed on each and every adjudicator to complete our assigned workloads, we are currently lacking the manpower, training, and office space to accomplish our mission and achieve what the job demands. These challenges cry out for reconsideration of S. 744 in its current plan, in its current form. A few days ago, a report released by Judicial Watch revealed that documents obtained through the Freedom of Information Act confirm all of Mr. Palinkas' concerns. The documents reveal that the administration has abandoned official background check procedures in order to keep up with the hundreds of thousands of amnesty applications and speed them up under the program. For example, according to a September 17, 2012 email from Associate Regional Director Gary Garman, field offices could expect the Benefits Center to conduct just, quote, lean and light background checks, with only random samples of modified cases being sent to the field for verification. It goes on to say about the inadequacy of the applications submitted for amnesty under the lean and light system. St. Paul Field Director Sharon Cooley emailed staffers in October of last year with the following observation, quote, as you are already aware, the applications will not be as complete and interview ready as we are used to seeing. This is a temporary situation. I just can't tell you when things will revert back to the way things used to be, close quote. So that's the kind of situation we're in today. Then on November 9th, 2012, last November, the entire agency was directed to halt all background checks. It is unknown how long USCIS stopped conducting these, but apparently they did. They may still be. Public safety threats or national security threats require that we do background checks. So in effect, you're in the position of moving people out of the shadows, as they say. We want to move people out of the shadows. We're moving many people without background checks that are criminals or may be connected to terrorist organizations from the shadows to broad daylight with absolute protection of legal immigration status. We shouldn't transform them from the shadows to legal status without some sort of serious analysis of who they are, as the officers tell us. And certainly all of the 300,000 that so far have been done, and probably over 2 million before long will go through this program, they're not all clean. All of them don't justify being made citizens of the United States. Some of them are criminal. Many of them will claim they came before 16 but didn't come before 16. If nobody's checking, nobody's digging into it, then this will become a common thing. You just submit some false documentation, nobody looks at it, and you're home free. Not a way we should be doing this. It's a kind of sliding, slipping away from real enforcement that has helped put us in the fix we're in today. So the Gang of Eights bill gives the Secretary, who's responsible for this policy, undermining this policy, the discretion to determine the specifics of the amnesty application process for the entire 11 million people that will be given legal status in the country, including the responsibility or the discretion to determine the specifics of the information required of the applicant, how much information you want, the form of the application, paper or electronic. Electronic ought to be a big part of it because you can immediately check with the National Crime Information Center on criminal backgrounds. It'd be easier. Whether any applicant is actually going to be interviewed or not, it requires the Secretary to collect biometric, biographic, and other data that the Secretary deems appropriate for use in conducting, quote, national security and enforcement clearances, which would be for use in those actions. But it doesn't require the Secretary to do any of that. And as I just noted, they're so determined to accelerate these other clearances that we can assume they won't be following strictly the implications of the law that would be passed. And this is the way and why our law enforcement officers are concerned about the bill. This is what's causing them angst. If the administration does not currently do even minimum interviews under the DACA program, they're not going to do it in the future when we have 11 million people being cleared. These clearances should include checks against federal and state law enforcement databases, biometric and biographic, including Department of Homeland Security, FBI databases, the consolidated watch list and lookout and biometric immigration databases are all out there, and they're there to identify people who may be in violation of the law, have warrants out for their arrest for murder, drug dealing, robbery, on a terrorist want list. That's why we have these systems. I offered an amendment during judiciary markup that would have mandated those checks as well as allowed for electronic applications so that information could be easily checked against the law enforcement electronic databases. They're all electronic. The application, if done electronically, experts tell us, it will work a lot simpler. But it wouldn't have required all of this, and it required and allowed for required in-person interviews where national security or public safety concerns arise. Not interviewing everybody, but we really probably should interview everybody. But this said, my amendment said just for those where national security or public safety concerns arise. And but under this legislation, the Secretary doesn't have to interview a single amnesty applicant. But my amendment was rejected. According to the bill's lead sponsor, Senator Schumer, requiring such safeguards is unacceptable because it would slow things down dramatically. It would be impossible, I'm quoting now, it would, quote, it would be impossible, it could take a year, 18 months, 2 years before this could all be done. We hope that most folks could get into within 6 months, close quote. So I would say this is the plan. They just say, again, we say we have an effective background checking system for all those that are going to be applying to be put on a guaranteed path to citizenship. We say we have a system, but to the American people we say that while failing to require any of that any effective way. Mr. President, I don't know, do we have time limit on this remarks, or I see some my colleagues here.
The senator may proceed for 3 additional minutes.
I thank the chair. Well, quick turnaround of applications seems to be far more important to the Gang of Eight than the issue of identifying people who may be a threat to public safety. Criminals got warrants out for them. Who may have been arrested and served time for felonies. You need to know that. They're not supposed to be given status if they have been convicted of a felony. Certainly shouldn't if they have a warrant for their arrest from which they've absconded. Despite what we learned from the 1986 amnesty, there, the failure to conduct adequate background checks in 1986 and vet for national security threats enabled both criminals and terrorists to be legalized. In a 2009 report by the Homeland Security Institute, prepared at the request of the USCIS Ombudsman in anticipation of immigration reform, concluded, quote, the potential volume of new cases generated by immigration reform legislation could overwhelm USCIS capabilities and capacities. I think that's true. The report also warned, quote, it is important to recognize that every ineligible illegal immigrant who comes across the border during the preparation and implementation phases of any new legalization program intending to apply for legal status entails yet another possible fraudulent application for a limited number of adjudicators to weed out, close quote. In other words, we're going to have people coming right now. The immigration flow has picked up dramatically once they've heard amnesty is afoot. And if you don't have any ability to do the kind of fundamental checking here, everybody will be successful and fraudulent applications will be cleared in large numbers. The bill does not require the Secretary to interview a single amnesty applicant, including those who might pose national security threats. Even the 2007 Immigration Reform Bill mandated in-person interviews, with terrorism concerns being one of the reasons. The 1986 amnesty, back in '86, required face-to-face interviews. No routine interviews are being conducted on the President's DACA program, his amnesty for those who came as teenagers, and there's no reason to expect there will be anything done in this program either, which is 22 times larger.
Senator's time has expired.
I thank the chair and would yield the floor and would ask permission to supplement my statement.
Without objection. Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I come to the floor today to discuss the recent national security leaks by a former NSA contractor, Edward Snowden. His name is known now throughout the world. Some have praised Snowden as a hero and a whistleblower. I do not. Anyone who violates their sworn oath to not disclose classified information and leak national security documents that compromise our intelligence operation and harms our country's ability to prevent future terrorist attacks should not be called a hero, nor a whistleblower. What Snowden has done borders on treason, and I believe he should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Mr. President, it's no secret we have a serious trust deficit here in this country toward the actions of the federal government. And I understand the concerns and the fears of my constituents and the American people relative to some of the things that are happening here that lead them to not put their trust in their elected officials or in their government. There's been a series of scandals over the past several months, including but not limited to the IRS targeting of conservative groups, the actions of Attorney General Eric Holder, and the ever-changing responses from this administration regarding the attacks on Americans in Benghazi. Still don't have the full story. And this narrative just keeps bouncing around with change after change after change. So I understand this distrust that the American people have about anything that comes out of Washington, D.C. A lot of this is being fueled by mischaracterizations and misrepresentations in the media, grabbing on to whatever is said in The Guardian. Of course, The Guardian says, and what people hear is, this is what's happening to your country. This is what's happening with your government. They are violating your civil rights and violating your privacy. And none of us stand for that, nor will we stand for that. But in their rush to be the first to break the news of the NSA or other classified programs, to break it first on air, the media has fueled this distrust of the American people by misrepresenting the facts. Contrary to what some news reports and other sources have said, let me say this for the record. The government is not and cannot indiscriminately listen in on any American's phone calls. It is not targeting the emails of innocent Americans. It is not indiscriminately collecting the content of their conversations. And it is not tracking the location of innocent Americans through cell towers or their cell phones. There are civil liberties and privacy protections built into this program that are now being released in great detail. And it's important the American people understand those and know what they are. We have to understand that this careful balancing act between protecting classified methods and sources to the detriment of losing that and losing lives and identifying sources and really compromising programs, and the need to reassure the American people that we are following the law and following the constitutional right of Americans to privacy, all of this has to be put in the right context. As a side note, let me just simply say, Mr. President, that it's ironic that a lot of American private companies seem to have more information about us than the government does. They may have a phone number, but many of the private companies know what we like to eat, where we shop, what we like to wear, you order, where you shop, where you like to vacation, and we're flooded with marketing attempts to address that information that they've collected against us. But that is not what the NSA is doing under these programs or the programs in question. These programs are in place solely for the purpose of detecting communications between terrorists who are operating outside of our country, but communicating with operatives potentially within the United States. The intelligence community does not have the time, nor the inclination, nor the authority to track your internet activity or pry into our private lives. And even if someone is suspected by the way of a phone call match with a foreign terrorist and someone residing or living in America and suspected of having a link to terrorism, the government can go no further than the court to get an order to investigate any other information or material about you. And let's not forget why these programs are there in the first place. Following the tragic attacks on September 11, 2001, America realized it needed to greatly improve our intelligence efforts and our communications among our agencies, where we're facing a different kind of war. This wasn't two states lining up against each other. This wasn't addressing wars of the past. This was a whole new way of attacking Americans on our homeland. We needed to modernize our approach, and we needed to connect the dots before a terrorist attack occurred again at the level of 911 or others. In fact, had these programs been available to NSA before that September day, I believe we could have identified some or all of the hijackers. When one of the September 11 hijackers called a contact in Yemen from San Diego, we could have identified him through this program. We could have prevented the terrorists from boarding those planes, blowing up the World Trade Center, striking the Pentagon, crashing into a field in Pennsylvania, and killing thousands of Americans.
Will Senator yield? Under the order, morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that I have just 2 more minutes to wrap up this statement.
Is there objection? Hearing none.
I thank you, Mr. President. What I've just explained is why these programs exist. They connect the dots and have successfully thwarted dozens of terrorist attacks. They are some of the most effective tools available to protect our country from terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda. And that is why I find it so troubling and, frankly, irresponsible for the media and, frankly, others to distort the nature of these counterterrorism programs. These programs are legal, constitutional, and utilized only under the strict oversight of both parties and all 3 branches of government, including a highly scrutinized judicial process. But in the end, these programs rely on the trust of the American people. And with that trust lacking today, I'm asking my fellow members of Congress, as well as the media, fact-check first before mischaracterizing programs that save lives. I believe we can and we must protect both security and liberty when it comes to counterterrorism efforts, and I believe these programs do just that. Mr. President, I thank you.
Under the previous order, the Senate will proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations, which the clerk will report.
Luis Felipe Restrepo of Pennsylvania to be United States District Judge. Kenneth John Gonzales of New Mexico to be United States District Judge.
Under the previous order, there will be 30 minutes for debate, equally divided and controlled in the usual form.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I'm pleased to rise today to strongly support the confirmation of Mr. Kenneth Gonzales for U.S. District Judge for the District of New Mexico. Mr. Gonzales is an exceptional nominee with an impressive range of legal experience and expertise. He was unanimously confirmed by the Senate as the U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico in 2010. But he is more than just his resume. Remarkable as he is also an inspiring American story. Mr. Gonzales grew up in the Milwaukee Valley in the northern part of our state. He was the first in his family to graduate from college. And with the help of scholarships and grants, he received his undergraduate and law degrees from the University of New Mexico, a school that I'm proud to call my alma mater. After graduating, he was a law clerk to New Mexico Supreme Court Justice Joseph Baca, and he worked as a legislative assistant for Senator Jeff Bingaman. He began his career as a federal prosecutor in the United States Attorney's Office for the District of New Mexico in 1999, prosecuting a wide range of federal offenses, including narcotics and violent crime cases. He holds the rank of Major as a judge advocate in the U.S. Army Reserve, which he joined in September 2001. He has provided critical legal assistance to hundreds of active and retired soldiers and spouses, both here and overseas. In 2008, he was called to active duty as a part of Operation Enduring Freedom, where he was stationed at Fort Bragg and served as a senior trial counsel. Mr. Gonzales has been an exemplary U.S. Attorney for the District of New Mexico. He oversees a broad array of criminal and civil cases. I'd also like to note that he has made Indian country a priority in the U.S. Attorney's Office, making a real difference in prosecuting cases of violence against Native women and children. Not surprisingly, his advice and counsel are highly valued. He serves on the Attorney General's advisory committees on Native American issues, on the Southwest border and immigration issues, and on the Environmental and Natural Resources Working Group, and is a member of the 10th Circuit Advisory Council. He is also a member of the New Mexico Hispanic Bar Association. If confirmed, he'll join only 58 other Hispanic active district court judges, less than 10% of the country's 677 district court judgeships. Mr. Gonzales is esteemed for his diverse experience, for his even temperament, and for his integrity. From a young man dreaming of going to college to his life in public service, his story is one of great determination and commitment. He has shown a reverence for and dedication to the law throughout his career. I urge his confirmation. I know that Ken Gonzales will serve New Mexico well on the bench. And with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, I'd like to take a few minutes to also speak about the nomination of Kenneth Gonzales to be a federal district judge for the District of New Mexico. Ken, as he's known back home to many of us, is truly a standout nominee. I wish I could take credit for his nomination, but that credit belongs to our former U.S. Senator Jeff Bingaman and to our senior Senator Tom Udall. But I want to thank both of them for putting forward such a great candidate for this position. And I'm very pleased to be here today to support him. Ken has a long and distinguished record of public service, including more than a decade of service in our military. Ken has served as the U.S. Attorney for New Mexico since April of 2010. And his elevation to lead that office followed more than a decade of service there as an Assistant U.S. Attorney. I'd like to highlight at least one of his many accomplishments that I find particularly important. I think Ken's efforts as U.S. Attorney demonstrate not only his character and his intellect, but the dedication that he has to serving his home state and to making it a better place for all our residents. Much of New Mexico is Indian country, for which the U.S. Attorney has responsibility to prosecute criminal activity. Ken has taken the initiative to reorganize and to focus the U.S. Attorney's resources to more effectively combat the higher-than-average rates of violent crime, sexual assault, and sexual abuse that have plagued Indian Country. This includes creating the first Indian Country crime section within any U.S. Attorney office. This section includes a team of lawyers responsible for pursuing felony offenses on tribal lands. The office is also collaborating with tribal prosecutors to investigate and prosecute domestic violence in more than 20 pueblos and tribes located throughout the state of New Mexico. This is just one example of Ken's work, but throughout his career, Ken has shown a dedication to serving the people of New Mexico. It is the sum of all his efforts and accomplishments that make me believe he will make an outstanding addition to the federal bench. And I'm pleased that today we're at the final step towards getting him here. The process for getting to the federal bench is a long road to travel. The Judiciary Committee leadership from both sides of the aisle takes seriously its responsibility to ensure that every nominee is fit to serve. And I want to say a special thanks to Senator Leahy and Senator Grassley for working together and with Senator Udall and myself to get Ken through this process. As the vetting process surely showed, Ken has the knowledge, temperament, and integrity to serve on the federal bench. And I have no doubt that he will distinguish himself there as he has throughout his entire legal career. I strongly support his nomination, and I urge all of my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President, and I would yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Senator from Georgia.
Mr. President, I'd like to address the Senate for 3 minutes as if in morning business.
Yes, Senator's in a quorum call.
I ask that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Ask permission to speak to the Senate for 3 minutes as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Mr. President, I rise proudly today to speak to a resolution that I've introduced in the United States Senate commending John Robert Lewis, congressman from the city of Atlanta, civil rights leader of the 1960s and 1950s, and my personal friend. In 1954, I was 10 years old in the Atlanta public schools when Brown versus the Board of Education was decided in the United States Supreme Court. John Lewis was 4 years older than me. He was born just outside of Pike County, Alabama, and went to the Pike County, Alabama segregated public schools. He went on to Fisk University to get a degree in religion and philosophy, and volunteered for sit-ins in Nashville to break the first sit-in on lunch counters in the history of that city. This year marks the 50th anniversary of what's called the Big Six in civil rights. As I'm sure the President will remember, it was 50 years ago this August that Martin Luther King led a march on Washington and gave his great speech, "I Have a Dream," on the Lincoln Memorial. There were 6 great civil rights leaders then. There's only one left, and that's John Robert Lewis. John is my friend, he's my compatriot, and our lives have paralleled each other all the way through. John introduced me when I was first elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, and I was honored for that introduction. And this year, I joined John on the 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, the historic march and the bloody march on Bloody Sunday, which turned around the Voting Rights Act, saw to it that every American got equal access to vote, and really changed the history of our country. It's an honor and a privilege for me to honor John today on this 50th anniversary of the crossing of the Edmund Pettus Bridge and honor a career that's been dedicated to liberty and freedom for all Americans. John recently suffered the loss of his beautiful wife, Lillian. She is survived by their son, John Miles Lewis. And John is a great leader to this day on the floor of the United States House, a great leader for the state of Georgia, and one with whom I am pleased to serve with as a United States Senator. History has many heroes, and we all know their pictures and their carvings are all over this Capitol. But none is greater than one that sacrificed their life for the rights of others and for everyone to enjoy the same rights that everyone else in America has. John Lewis is such a person. I'm honored to recognize him with this resolution today, and I thank the President of the Senate for the time to make the speech. And I yield back my time, or yield to the distinguished Senator from Vermont.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I thank my dear colleague from Georgia, and President, I have a longer statement of place in the record, but and obviously I support the nominees that are before us, both of them. I don't know if we will have roll call votes on both, but I strongly support both of them. But on the question of nominations, I attended President Obama's announcement of the nominations D.C. Circuit a couple weeks ago. And I've heard some of my colleagues on the Republican side being very critical of the President for not sending nominations for judicial vacancies to the Senate, even though when he has some of them, they've held them up for over a year or more before they, or 6 months to a year before they then vote overwhelmingly for the person, but they'll hold them up, and then they say, why don't you send up more people? And frankly, a lot of people say, why should I spend 6 months or a year waiting while they hold me up? But now the President has sent nominees for the multiple vacancies that continue on the D.C. Circuit. So the same senators who were complaining that he wasn't setting up nominees now say that he's setting up too many. My friends on the other side of the aisle are saying, you're not setting up enough, but you're setting up too many. I think maybe the American people see the fallacy in that argument. Having been unfairly criticized in connection with the nomination of Judge Srinivasan, I was told, why did you get him up here earlier for a vote, even though Republicans asked us to delay him? I'll be making I've learned from that cooperating and delaying at their request, I'm going to get criticized for delaying, so we might as well get forward. I'll be making every effort to schedule prompt hearings for these impressive nominees, each of whom received the highest possible rating of well qualified from the nonpartisan ABA Standing Committee of the Federal Judiciary. So we have 3 people at the highest possible rating. And the last time we had something for D.C. Circuit, even though the Republicans said, let's keep delaying, and I did at their request, and they criticized me for delaying, here they are. We'll go forward with them. I've consulted the ranking Republican in the committee. I informed them that I plan to notice the first hearing for July 10. So that gives plenty of time for everybody to read all the record. They're going to be on vacation for the 4th of July week. They can read it during vacation. That'll be 36 days since the nomination, and a slightly slower timeline than we followed for the more recent confirmation of nominees to the 8th Circuit. And I plan to include the nomination of Patricia Millett of Virginia, which should have broad bipartisan support in our July 10th confirmation hearing. So I urge those Republicans who say, first, the President's not moving fast enough, and then when he does move, say he's moving too fast, reconsider their approach, work with the President. Let's have fair hearings on these 3 nominees and go forward with them. If we do have confidence, we agree they're well-qualified judges. It's disappointing that the same Republican senators who said during the George W. Bush administration the D.C. Circuit should have 11 filled judgeships who voted to confirm President Bush's nominees for the 9th, 10th, and 11th seats. Now, when there's a Democrat in the White House, they say, oh, no, they shouldn't be filled. And it seems that this president has to be treated differently than the previous presidents. I'm not sure why the difference, but that's what they want. Well, frankly, I voted for a lot of President Bush's nominees, as I have. In fact, I'd say that I voted for 97 to 98% of all Republican nominees over 38 years. I voted for more Republican nominees than any Republican presently in the Senate for judges. There's no Republican in the Senate who has voted for more Republican nominees of Republican presidents for judgeships than I have. So I don't need to lecture about voting up. I'd ask consent my full statement be made part of the record.
Without objection.
And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from Iowa.
I'm going to vote for all of the judges that are on the for the roll calls and silent votes today. So I'm going to spend my time, instead of speaking about the people that we're going to vote for, in response to what my chairman just stated about the record of confirming judges. So I want to inform my fellow senators and American people regarding the facts on judicial nominations. Today we will confirm 2 more nominees. I would note that we confirmed 2 judges just 4 days ago. After today, the Senate will have confirmed 197 lower court nominees. We've defeated 2. So on a score of 197 to 2, I think it's a pretty outstanding record. That's a success rate of the President's nominees being approved 99%. And we have been doing that at a fast pace. During the last Congress, we confirmed more judges than any Congress since the 103rd Congress, and that Congress sat during the years of 93 and 94. This year, the beginning of President Obama's second term, we have already confirmed more judges than were confirmed in the entire first year of President Bush's second term. It's good for emphasis again. We've already confirmed more nominees this year than we did during the entirety of 2005, the first year of President Bush's second term. After today, there will only be 5 Article III judges remaining on the executive calendar to be considered by this Senate. Those are 3 district nominees and 2 circuit nominees. 2 of those were reported out last week, 2 more about a month ago, and 1 has been on the calendar about 2 months. Yet somehow, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle cite this as evidence of obstructionism. Compare that, then, to the calendar of June 2004, when 30 judicial nominees were on the calendar, 10 circuit and 10 district. In fact, 4 of those were from Pennsylvania, as is one of the nominees today, and I don't recall any Senate Democrat complaining about how many nominations were piling up at the calendar during that time of 2004. Nor do I remember protestations from my colleagues on the other side that judicial nominees were moving too slowly. Last week, when we confirmed 2 Pennsylvania judges, there were statements made on the floor that we were treating President Obama's nominees very different than those of President Bush's. So, again, let's look at the record. As I said, there were 4 Pennsylvania nominees on the calendar June of 2004. Gene Prater was nominated November 2003, had a hearing the following January, was reported in March, confirmed June. Lord Stengel was nominated November 2003, had a hearing the following February, was reported in March, was confirmed in June. Juan Sanchez was nominated in November, had a hearing the following February, was reported in March, and was confirmed in June. Those milestones are nearly identical to other Pennsylvanian nominees today who was nominated last November, just like the ones I mentioned. He had a hearing the following February, was reported in March, and now will be confirmed in June. If we have been unfair to this nominee, as it is now claimed, where was the outcry from Senate Democrats on the Bush nominees that I just described? The fact is, there is no difference in how this president's nominees are being treated versus how President Bush's nominees were being treated. Remember, there are only 5 Article III judicial nominees remaining after the vote on these 2 today. Yet, as I mentioned, in June 2004, there were 30 nominations pending on the calendar. Some of those nominees had been reported out more than a year earlier, and most were pending for months, and some of them never got an up or down vote. The bottom line is that the Senate is processing the President's nominees exceptionally fair. President Obama certainly is being treated more fairly in the beginning of his second term than Senate Democrats treated President Bush in 2005. It is not clear to me how allowing more votes so far this year than President Bush got in an entire 12-month period of time amounts to, quote, unprecedented delay and obstruction, end of quote. Yet that is the complaint that we hear over and over from the other side. Last week, it was stated that with the president, quote, Republicans have never let vacancies get below 72, end of quote. Mr. President, after today's vote, there will be 77 vacancies in the federal judiciary, but 52 of those spots are without nominee. So how is it Republicans' fault, then, that the President has not sent 52 nominees up here to the committee? Because we obviously, common sense ought to tell you that we can't act on nominees who are not presented to the Senate. Just one example will illustrate. Last week, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee singled out the vacancies on the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. We're confirming the 3rd judge to that court after 2 last week. 4 vacancies remain, but there are no nominees pending in the Senate for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania. It was also stated that the seat we're filling today has been vacant for 4 years, as if Republicans were to blame for that. The fact is that the seat went vacant June the 8th, 2009. President Obama was the president then. He waited over 3 years and 5 months before making a nomination November the 7th, 2012. Why did the president make the people of Pennsylvania wait so long, and why are Republicans being blamed because they have to wait so long? That wasn't the fault on this side of the aisle, yet now we are accused of obstruction. So I just wanted to set the record straight, set it straight again before we vote on these nominees. I expect they will both be confirmed, and I congratulate them on their confirmations. And I want to place the balance of my statement in the record, and as I said at the beginning, I'm going to vote to support these nominees. I yield the floor, and I suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Instead of telling
In a couple of minutes, votes on judicial nominations, one for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and another for the District of New Mexico. That's happening here in the Senate, scheduled for 5:30 Eastern Time. Tomorrow, the House Intelligence Committee holds a hearing about National Security Agency programs with the director of the NSA, as well as others from the FBI and Justice Department. We'll have that live at 10 a.m. Eastern on C-SPAN 3.
Mr. President.
Senator from Vermont.
President, I ask consent to call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection.
President, I ask that any time remaining be yielded back.
Without objection, all time is yielded back. The question occurs on the Restrepo nomination. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. Nomination is confirmed.
Thank you.
Under the previous order, the question occurs on the Gonzales nomination.
I believe there's a request for yeas and nays on it, so I'd request the yeas and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Chiesa, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Cowan, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin.
I'm delighted for you. I'm glad you were friends.
Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe.
Huh? I think so.
Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden, Senators voting in the affirmative: Chiesa, Cowan, Grassley, Heinrich, Isaacson, Johans, Kane, King, Leahy, McCaskill, Menendez, and Paul. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse. Aye. Mrs. Shaheen. Mrs. Shaheen. Aye. Mr. Alexander. Mr. Alexander. Aye. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Merkley. Aye. Ms. Landrieu. Ms. Landrieu. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin. Aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain. Aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham. Aye. Mr. Corker. Mr. Corker. Aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, South Dakota. Aye. Mr. Tester. Mr. Tester. Aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders. Aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Lee. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mrs. Fisher. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. McConnell. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Heitkamp. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mr. Burr. Mr. Burr, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Brasso, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Portman. Mr. Portman, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Warner, Mr. Warner.
How are you, sir?
Aye. Mr. Bozeman, Mr. Bozeman. Aye. Mr. Cardin, Mr. Cardin. Aye. Mr. Heller, Mr. Heller. Aye. Mrs. Hagan, Mrs. Hagan. Aye. Mr. Pryor, Mr. Pryor. Aye. Mr. Cruz, Mr. Cruz. Aye. Mr. Murphy, Mr. Murphy. Aye. Mr. Levin, Mr. Levin. Aye. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Rubio. Aye. Mr. Flake, Mr. Flake. Aye. Mr. Scott, Mr. Scott. Aye. Mr. Risch, Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Crapo, Mr. Crapo. Aye. Ms. Hirono, Ms. Hirono. Aye. Mr. Udall, Mr. Udall of Colorado. Aye. Mr. Sessions, Mr. Sessions. Aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett? Aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich? Aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray? Aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin? Aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island? Aye. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren? Aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Casey. Mr. Casey, aye.
Does any senator in the chamber wish to vote or change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 89, the nays are 0, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous, the majority leader.
As unanimous consent, we now proceed to morning business from now until 20 till 7. And that during that period of time, it's my understanding there is a colloquy to be between Senator Brown and Senator Isaacson that will take that 15 minutes.
Without objection.
When that time's up, I ask to be recognized.
Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid upon the table. The President will be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session.
Madam President.
The Senator from Georgia.
I ask to be recognized along with Senator Brown for Ohio for up to 15 minutes and to engage in the colloquy.
Without objection.
And I thank the Majority Leader for his kindness in letting us go forward. You know, I'm proud to stand up here today as a resident of Georgia and its capital city, Atlanta, which is the home of the Center for Disease Control and Prevention in America, a great institution to which Senator Brown and I are most familiar and want to talk about some of its great achievements here today. CDC is the nation's health protection agency, but it's really the world's health protection agency. What CDC has done is build a strong national public health and disease detection network for working with state, local agencies, private partners, and universities and communities to stop disease and stop outbreaks. By way of example, CDC led a multi-state response to last year's fungal meningitis outbreak that resulted in 745 infections, 58 deaths in 20 states. CDC identified and contained dangerous foodborne pathogen outbreaks such as hepatitis A found in frozen berry blend, salmonella found in the poultry industry, and E. coli found in frozen food products. CDC puts science into action every day to protect the American people, using breakthroughs such as microbial genomics to find outbreaks sooner, stop them earlier, and prevent them better. Environmental hazards, biosecurity threats, and natural disasters. CDC provided direct support within hours of the Superstorm Sandy that devastated Northeast last year. We need to be able to have CDC to be ready for this year's hurricane season as it deals with other public threats. CDC provides crucial information on the health status of the risk to the American people. The data it helps determine the best options for preventing illness, reducing medical costs. At a time when the U.S. government is not looked upon with a lot of favor by the American people, I think it's very interesting to note that a recent Gallup poll identified as CDC as the most trusted federal government agency with the American people. I think that's something we owe a tip of the hat to. Senator Brown?
Thank you, Senator Isaacson. I'm so appreciative of the work that he's done with Centers for Disease Control in his home state of Atlanta. There's no federal agency that quite like the CDC in this country or across the world. Our nation's fiscal health can't be strengthened it cannot be strengthened at the expense of our nation's public health. In the 21st century, it's easy to overlook this country's public health safety net. Too often we take for granted that our children aren't being crippled by polio or dying from whooping cough because we have immunizations. We take for granted that we have stronger teeth and less tooth decay because of water fluoridation in many of our communities. We take for granted that few people in this country now die of infectious diseases like cholera and tuberculosis because we've made the kind of remarkable progress we have in sanitation, in hygiene, and antibiotics, and disease surveillance. We take these advancements for granted because for over 6 decades, the CDC has been doing an extraordinary job of ensuring Americans have basic health protections. The CDC's work, along with that of other public health advocates and researchers, is credited with increasing the average American's life expectancy over the last many decades, increasing the average American's life expectancy by 25 years. 25 years, a quarter of a century longer because of our investment in public health. The CDC's reach and responsibilities, as intimated by Senator Isaacson, aren't limited by our country's borders. Due to globalization, it matters a great deal how other countries respond to health threats, and the CDC plays an essential role in helping their international partners react to these threats. The CDC is the gold standard, the global leader in disease preparedness and public health prevention. Other nations follow our lead. Yet the CDC's leadership is not guaranteed. Even with its top-notch facilities and world-class staff, the CDC faces challenges to this continued leadership. The CDC's base budget authority is its lowest level in a decade. The fiscal year 13 budget is about $600 million below its fiscal year 2012 level. This reduction undercuts the health security of all Americans, even those that never once think of the existence of the Centers for Disease Control. Reduction in the CDC budget has harmful immediate and long-term consequences across the U.S. and around the world. This reduction affects the ability of our state and local health departments to provide on-the-ground services. As my friend from Georgia explained during his discussion of the deadly fungal meningitis outbreak, funding the CDC is critical to the foundation of our public health. When we invest in CDC, we invest in the health of families in Coleraine, Ohio, and Cuyahoga Falls, Ohio. When we invest in CDC, we support programs such as the Epidemiology Laboratory Capacity Program that addresses infectious disease threats. When we invest in the CDC, we ensure our state and local health departments on the front lines are able to detect the first signs of outbreak. Without this critical funding, we leave ourselves vulnerable to the initial spread of health threats, such as fungal meningitis and emerging new diseases, such as the MERS, coronavirus, and the novel H7N9 avian flu virus, which we read about. Public health departments across the nation have unfortunately already lost thousands of jobs and will lose more if CDC continues to dwindle. And then before turning it back over to Senator Isaacson, I'd like to emphasize a point he made. The CDC responds to long-term health threats as well as to urgent, immediate health dangers. These threats don't make the headlines. So much of CDC's work you never hear about, you never read about, because its name, Centers for Disease and Prevention, is such an important part of this. CDC continues a long-standing tradition of working in partnership with many international organizations and global partners to ensure that our country takes the lead in stopping these threats. I've had the pleasure of seeing CDC's dedicated expert staff working in Africa and in Atlanta and in communities like Medina County, Ohio, and all over the world, working to keep these countries and our communities healthier and safer and keeping Americans safe as well.
Will the Senator from Ohio yield for a moment?
Sure, I yield the Senator.
You know, I ran a company for 20 years, and a healthy workforce that was ready and willing and able to go to work every single day made a big difference. A lot of times we think of CDC, we think of outbreaks in Africa, we think of Ebola, we think of salmonella, but in fact, it's also an advocate for wellness, better health habits, and a healthier America. Don't you think that's important for the productivity of the American people and the American worker?
Yeah, I thank the senator from Georgia. I think that's exactly the point, that the CDC, while perhaps those who know of the CDC, and obviously in the state of Georgia people know it more intimately than in my state, they more likely think of CDC doing something in Africa or Asia, not so much what it means locally. We know that our hospitals, for instance, are sometimes havens for unnecessary illnesses due to health care, to infections acquired in the hospital, antibiotic-resistant superbugs such as CRE, a family of germs with high levels of resistance to antibiotics. I wonder if my friend is familiar with CDC's work in these areas, if he would expand on that.
I appreciate your focus on that. You know, my friend from Ohio is exactly correct. The antimicrobial resistance is a serious threat to our nation's health. Many bacteria have become resistant to multiple classes of antibiotics. And I might add a personal note at this point. 3 years ago, I developed a MRSA infection in a hospital in Atlanta and almost lost my life to an antibiotic-resistant disease and infection. So I know how important it is to have a research facility like the CDC that can constantly stay one step ahead of the evolution of defenses these microbes bring up themselves. As a recent example, a recent outbreak of drug-resistant CRE, where 1 in 2 patients affected with the bacteria unfortunately passes away, CDC must have resources to quickly track and stop outbreaks and give health care providers timely information. Without that, you have the risk of a contagion.
So that's certainly right. It seems there are new emerging and potentially dangerous health threats. We obviously know of the disease you just, of the acquired infection you just mentioned. We know now of the H7N9 bird flu and MERS. How do you see, Senator Isaacson's how do you see CDC's unique role in tracking and attempting to prevent the spread of these threats before they reach our shores, before we in American hospitals at Grady Memorial or at Med Central in Mansfield, Ohio, might be victims of that?
Well, you make a great point, because CDC is kind of the crucible where all the partners in healthcare in the country come together. You might remember when we were here on 9/11/2001, shortly after the attacks on the Trade Center in New York, and then the anthrax letters started being mailed to Capitol Hill. It was CDC within days that tracked down the anthrax and helped us develop the defenses so we didn't have a problem with the anthrax infection, and got the Cipro distributed to those who were exposed to keep them from succumbing to that disease. That's the kind of timely effort that you need from an agency like CDC to be able to quickly respond. Public health security is a component of our national security, as evidenced by the anthrax case. Potential threat of engineered biological weapons, CDC remains vigilant and ready to act with experts and countermeasures to protect the American people. With emerging diseases such as MERS and H7N9, CDC has sent teams around the globe to investigate their origin, develop and ship laboratory diagnostic kits to the affected areas, and save lives day in and day out in the world.
Well, if the Senator would yield again for a moment. The MERS was identified recently. CDC scientists, as you know, developed and shipped a diagnostic kit to be used in the field. Talk about, one of the things that when I've talked to people about public health and about certainly the importance of NIH, but especially in the focus in public health of CDC, we talk about polio and what CDC did to address and not quite yet wipe out, but in our country certainly wipe out, in most of the rest of the world, the polio virus. Give us a little bit of history and how important that was and what we learned from that, if you would, Senator Isaacson.
Well, when I grew up in the 50s, I remember taking the sugar cube anti-polio vaccine, the Jonas Salk vaccine, for the first time ever. Polio has been a dread disease that's affected the American people and people around the world for years, but now it is almost totally eradicated. Why? Because of a worldwide effort by many organizations, not the least of which CDC, is to see to it that the inoculations are made available. In fact, polio now only resides in 3 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Nigeria. We're close to closing the door and having a polio-free world, just like we're getting closer and closer to eradicating measles, which now primarily still has an outbreak in Nigeria. CDC's readiness and ability to deploy at a moment's notice makes all the difference in the world. I don't want to sell here, but I have to make one note. One of the reasons CDC is in Atlanta, and that's such a good location, is they can be anywhere in the world in a matter of a day by the Hartsfield International Airport, and not a day goes by that somewhere around the world a country or a community calls and says, we need help. We've got a problem that we don't know what it is, but it has to be identified. And CDC scientists and doctors are put on the planes and fly around the world to diagnose, identify, and provide the cure so the disease does not get into an outbreak that takes thousands of lives.
Thank you. And in closing, I want to just close with a personal story about polio. My brother, born in 1947, was of the 3 of us and 3 boys in the family. My brother's the oldest, my brother Bob. And when he was in about the 1st or 2nd or 3rd, maybe the 3rd grade, my father, who was a local family physician in Mansfield, was asked by, if not the CDC, some national health organization, to give polio vaccine in Mansfield, Ohio, as there were doctors in other communities asked to do that. And they chose my father in part because he was a good doctor. They also chose him because he had a son, had a child that was in 2nd or 3rd or 4th grade at the time. And people were afraid, they weren't sure about injecting that vaccine into their arm because a lot of families thought that actually could cause polio. There was all of that fear. Scientists didn't believe that, but an awful lot of people did. So there's a picture on the front page of the Mansfield News Journal in the mid-1950s of my brother getting a polio vaccine. It was, I believe his was Salk. Sabin came later with the cube. He got the Salk vaccine administered by my dad. And CDC or one of the public health groups, I apologize, I don't know which made sure that happened all over the country so people could be more reassured. And that was really the beginning with Salk and then Sabin of the eradication of polio in this country. And it's hard to think back. The presiding officer is not old enough that Senator Isaacson and I can remember with our parents the fear in the until into the 1950s of parents that their child would go swimming and might come back as Franklin Roosevelt did with a case of polio, and whatever the causes of that virus spreading scared so many people. So I think in these days of hyper-partisanship consuming Washington, I appreciate the work of Senator Isaacson on working together with CDC, because this is far and away more important than any political kinds of differences that we might have. And I'll let Senator Isaacson close.
Well, I appreciate very much the Senator's focus on CDC. And I think it's ironic we close talking about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because in the 1940s, as our president, he suffered from polio. and would take the train to Georgia and go down to Warm Springs to get the therapy of those Warm Springs, which then was the only mechanism of treating polio. Today in Georgia, because of CDC, we have a mechanism of eradicating polio. That's the type of evolution we want to see in health care, for not just for our country, but for the world. CDC is the best investment of American tax dollars we could possibly make. I support it wholeheartedly, and I thank Senator Brown for his participation in the colloquy today. And yield back the balance of our time and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Both of the judicial nominations considered by the Senate this afternoon were approved, one for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania and the other for the District of New Mexico. The Senate is into its second week of debate on the immigration bill. A roll call writes that just hours after the Supreme Court ruled that federal law preempted Arizona from requiring proof of citizenship to register to vote, Senator Ted Cruz said he would try to change that. The Texas Republican made the announcement on Twitter, and the tweet said, "I'll file an amendment to the immigration bill that permits states to require ID before registering voters and close this hole in federal statutory law." The roll call story goes on to say that Cruz's voter ID amendment will add to an already lengthy list of amendments expected on the overhaul. A debate has been slow-moving, with work continuing on lining up packages of amendments.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I ask to vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
And I ask to speak as if within morning business.
Without objection.
Thank you, Madam President. Like many others, I'm deeply disturbed by the current situation in Syria. The appalling atrocities, the tragic loss of life, the reported use of chemical weapons. This deserves the clear condemnation of the international community. But I am also concerned by the push for intervention in this war, by the rush to judgment for the United States to yet again become entangled in a civil war. The President has decided to send arms to the rebels to fight the government of Bashar al-Assad. The full scope of this intervention is not yet clear, but this path is dangerous and unnecessary. The Assad regime is cruel and corrupt. We can all agree on that point. But many of the groups fighting against him do not share our values and could be worse. They may pose long-term risk to us and to our allies. Assad's enemies may very well be America's enemies. The fact is, we do not know. A number of experts, including our military brass, have sounded alarms warning that the options to intervene in Syria range from bad to worse and could prove damaging to America's strategic interests. By flooding Syria with weapons, we risk arming those who ultimately may seek to do us harm. We have been down this road before, and recent history tells a cautionary tale. In the 1980s, the United States supported a rebel insurgency to repel the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. Back then, as now, many members of Congress pushed for arming these rebels. The United States supplied weapons, intelligence, and training with the goal to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan. Our short-term victory had tragic consequences for the future. Radical members of the insurgency formed the Taliban regime, giving safe haven to terrorist training camps, providing material support to Osama bin Laden and his fledgling al-Qaeda movement. Through state-sponsored terrorism in Afghanistan, al-Qaeda thrived and perpetrated attacks on the USS Cole and the World Trade Center on 9/11. The aftermath has been more than a decade of war, with tragic loss of American lives and treasure. This is history to learn from, not repeat. And yet many who advocated for previously disastrous Middle East interventions are leading the charge to arm groups we know little about and to declare war through airstrikes on another Middle Eastern country. What little we do know about the Syrian rebels is extremely disturbing. The opposition is fractured. Some are sympathetic to the enemies of the United States and our allies, including Israel and Turkey. There are reliable reports that some of the rebels even include Iraqi Sunni insurgents, the same groups who killed many United States troops and still target the current Iraqi army and government. We know that American law currently considers some of the rebel elements to be terrorist groups. The U.S. has designated one of the key opposition factions, the Nusra Front, as a terrorist organization for being an al-Qaeda-affiliated group. I notice our leader is on the floor, and so I would just yield to the leader and hope that my remarks can be in the record, included in one sequence.
Without objection.
Madam President, I appreciate very much the courtesy of my friend from New Mexico. Madam President.
The Majority Leader.
I now ask unanimous consent that when the Senate resumes consideration of S-744, that's the immigration bill, on Tuesday, June 18th, the time until 12:30 and the time from 2:15 to 3 p.m. be equally divided between the two leaders or the designees for debate on the pending amendments, and that at 3 p.m. the Senate proceed to votes on the amendments listed below. I would just ask staff, there will be no morning business tomorrow.
There is.
Well?
This is after leader remarks and morning business, we go to this. When we resume consideration, we can do that after morning business. That's all.
Okay, so on with my consent suggestion. That at 3 p.m. the Senate proceed to votes on the amendments listed below in the following order. Thune, 1197, Landrieu, 1222, Vitter, 1228, Tester, 1198. That there be no second-degree amendments in order prior to the votes. That all the amendments be subject to a 60 affirmative vote threshold. That there be 2 minutes equally divided in between the votes. That after the first vote, they be 10 minutes. Madam President, I've spoken to my friend, the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee, the senior senator from Iowa, and I wanted to add the Heller amendment. However, I think that I understand the Republicans want to pick their own amendments. They don't want me picking them, so I understand that. So I haven't included that in the consent agreement.
Is there objection? Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President.
The senator from New Mexico.
Madam President, I would ask consent that my remarks all be in one sequence in the record, and then I just have a couple of more minutes, Senator Grassley, so I'll finish up here.
Without objection.
Thank you. Speaking of the Syrian opposition, the opposition is very unorganized. They lack a chain of command. They are subject to deadly infighting, and if they are able to defeat Assad, they may turn on each other, or worse, the United States or our allies. Simply put, once we have introduced arms, neither we nor their fighters may be able to guarantee control over them. Such weapons could end up in the hands of groups and people who do not represent our interests, possibly including terrorists who target the United States, our allies like Israel and Turkey, and the Iraqi army and government. An Iraq that we spend billions of dollars and thousands of American lives to establish. Given this reality, those who are pushing for military intervention should answer three basic questions. Can arms be reasonably accounted for and kept out of the hands of terrorist and extremist groups? Can they assure us that those arms will not become a threat to our regional allies and friends, including Israel, Turkey, and the government of Iraq? And if the answer to the two previous questions is no, can they explain why transferring our weapons to the rebels, whose members may themselves be affiliated with terrorist and extremist groups, is a sensible option for the American people? What national interest does this serve? I do not believe that those questions have been answered. I think the majority of the American people agree. They do not see the justification of our intervention in this civil war. We need to slow down this clamor for more weapons and war to Syria, and to take a step back from this plunge into very muddy and dangerous waters. Stopping radicalism and protecting our allies is of vital importance. However, we come to the ultimate question, and one that has not been adequately answered. Will this hasty march to intervene in another Middle East conflict achieve these goals? Or will it ultimately harm the interests of the United States, leading to yet another bloody, costly overseas conflict, and ironically worsening the terrorist threat? We should listen to the lessons of history. After over a decade of war overseas, now is not the time to arm an unorganized, unfamiliar, and unpredictable group of rebels. Now is not the time to rush headlong into another Middle Eastern civil war. The winds of war are blowing yet again, and we should be ever vigilant before we venture into another storm. Thank you, Madam President. I yield the floor.
Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-744, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 80, S-744, a bill to provide for comprehensive immigration reform and for other purposes.
Madam President.
The senator from Iowa.
At every confirmation hearing of every cabinet position, and probably a lot of other positions as well, invariably a cabinet nominee is asked a question similar to, will you come to, when you're called to a committee meeting for a hearing, will you come? Will you answer inquiries made by members of the committee to certain questions you might be asked? Invariably, and I don't know an exception to this, we get the answer, yes, they will respond to our communiques. Well, I come to the Senate today to ask how come Secretary Napolitano of Homeland Security hasn't answered inquiries that we've made that ought to be made by now. The answers ought to be made by now because we're dealing with the legislation the questions referred to. So on April the 23rd, the Judiciary Committee held a hearing to discuss immigration reform, and the bill presented by the group of 8, Secretary Napolitano was the only witness. The hearing lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, and most members were able to ask her 5 to 10 minutes worth of questions. We submitted questions for the record, which means we submitted questions to her in writing for her to answer. We were given just 24 hours to turn around the questions for the committee to present to her. Now it has been over 7 weeks, that's more than 49 days, since we submitted those questions to Secretary Napolitano. We have yet to get answers to those questions. The questions I asked were genuine and related to the implementation of the bill if it were to be signed into law. I asked questions of the Secretary because she will be responsible for carrying out Congress's intentions. I wanted to know about costs and feasibility, and I asked for data and specifics. So I'm concerned that I have yet to receive responses. Keeping information from Congress and the American people is not helpful to ensuring that we have the best product coming out of the Senate. And since this bill is right now before the United States Senate, it would be important for members of this body to have answers to the questions that I'm going to tell you that I submitted to her. So I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss some of the questions that I asked of Secretary Napolitano, not all of them. Right now I'd like to focus on 9 questions that I asked about border security, because border security is the issue before the United States Senate as part of this 1,175-page bill. I may discuss other questions later in the week. Question number 1. Secretary Napolitano, you have emphasized that apprehension at the borders are down, and in doing so, praise the administration's record on border security. However, Customs and Border Protection has just released numbers showing that apprehension increased 13% over the last year. Does the fact that border apprehensions are up mean that border is becoming less secure? Question number 1 to Secretary Napolitano. And obviously, is the border more secure or isn't the border more secure? That's the whole basis of the debate over the last week in this body. Question number 2 to Secretary Napolitano. The bill only calls for establishing an entry-exit system for air and seaports before implementing the path to citizenship. Aside from costs, what impediments are there to instituting the system at land ports? Question number 3. The bill requires your department to establish a strategy to identify where fencing should be deployed along the southern border. During the hearing, you, meaning Secretary Napolitano, indicated that the administration believes that sufficient fencing is in place and that you would prefer not to increase fencing along the southern border. So my question, do you anticipate that your study will call for any additional physical fencing? Now that seems to be a pretty important question at this time when border security is very basic to whether or not there will be any legalization. We have not received an answer yet. Question number 4. During the hearing, we discussed the fact that the northern border was not part of the trigger and did not need to be secured before green cards are distributed. You said that the northern border is a different border, but that it's part of the discussion. Can you elaborate? Can you describe how the northern border is different? Please provide a list of quote-unquote other than Canadians that have crossed the northern border illegally in the last 10 years, including their country of origin? Question number 5. Section 1102 of S. 744 requires the Secretary to increase the number of CBP, the Customs and Border Patrol officers, by 3,500. However, it does not specify how many of those agents will be used to secure the physical border versus customs enforcement and other mission requirements. How do you envision this section being implemented, and how would the Department make decisions with regard to determining how many agents are hired to secure the physical borders? Talking about border security, it seems to me that's a legitimate question that ought to be answered by the Secretary a long time before we even started debate on this bill, but surely before we get done with it. 6th question. Section 1104 provides funding for only the Tucson sector of the southwest border region. Does the administration support only resources to this sector? Are there other sectors that should be included? If so, please provide details. 7th question. Section 1105 relates solely to the state of Arizona. Should this provision be expanded to all of the southwest border states? Question number 8. Section 1107 provides for a grant program in which individuals who reside or work in the border region and are, quote, at greater risk of border violence due to the lack of cellular service, end of quote, can apply to purchase phones with access to 911 and equipped with GPS. Does the administration believe that the southwest border region is safe and secure, rendering this grant program unnecessary? Question number 9, and my last question that I'll discuss tonight. Does the administration have any views on Section 1111 on the use of force, including the requirement that the Department collaborate with the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice, end of quote. Now, those are the 9 questions that I think are very pertinent to just the part of the bill that we spent the last week debating, and we're going to spend a few more days debating. Is the border secure? Very basic to everything else that goes on in this piece of legislation. So as I said, the questions I have asked the Secretary are meant to ensure that we pass the best bill possible. We ought to know how she will carry out the bill if it's signed into law. I hope she'll provide these answers and the other questions that I submitted on April the 24th. I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Now, you got...
Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid announced a short time ago that there'll be votes on 4 amendments to the immigration bill tomorrow, happening in the afternoon at 3 Eastern. Those amendments deal with adoption of foreign children, visa tracking, tracking of people who enter the U.S., and completing the border fence between the U.S. and Mexico before granting provisional immigration status. As we wait for a senator to speak, some news from the Associated Press. The White House is threatening to veto the House version of a 5-year farm bill. The House is preparing to consider that legislation this week, and it would cut $2 billion annually from food stamps, and Associated Press writing that it will make it harder for some people to qualify for the program. The Senate has already passed its version of the farm bill, cutting food stamps by $4 billion over 10 years. We see Senator Angus King of Maine in the chamber. After approving 2 judicial nominations this afternoon, Senate is back to considering amendments to the immigration bill. 4 votes are expected tomorrow at 3 in Eastern Time. Here's what the Associated Press is writing about the G8 summit being held in Northern Ireland. Russian President Vladimir Putin told President Obama today that their positions on Syria do not coincide, but the 2 leaders said that they have shared interest in stopping the violence in the Middle Eastern country. While President Putin has called for negotiated peace talks, he has not urged Syrian President Assad to leave power, and he remains one of Assad's strongest political and military allies. The U.S. continues to call for President Assad to step down.
The senator from Maine.
I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be rescinded.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of calendar number 75S330.
The clerk will report.
Calendar number 75S330, a bill to amend the Public Health Service Act to establish safeguards and standards of quality for research and transplantation of organs and so forth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I further ask that the committee reported substitute be considered, the Grassley amendment, which is at the desk, be agreed to, the substitute as amended be agreed to, the bill as amended be read a third time and passed, and the motions to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the appointment at the desk appear separately in the record as if made by the chair.
Without objection.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes its business today, it adjourn until 10 a.m. on Tuesday, June 18th, 2013, that following the prayer and pledge, the morning hour be deemed expired, the Journal of Proceedings be approved to date, and the time for the 2 leaders be reserved for their use later in the day. and that following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business for 1 hour, with senators permitted to speak therein for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the two leaders or their designees, with the Republicans controlling the first half and the majority controlling the final half. That following morning business, the Senate resume consideration of S. 744, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Bill, under the previous order. And finally, that the Senate recess from 12:30 p.m. until 2:15 p.m. to allow for the weekly caucus meetings. There will be up to 4 roll call votes at 3 p.m. in relation to the amendments to the immigration bill tomorrow. If there is no further business to come before the Senate, I ask that it adjourn under the previous order.
The Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
So that wraps up the first Senate session of the week. Lawmakers today approving a pair of judicial nominations before returning to the Gang of Eight's immigration proposal. Majority Leader Reid said he hopes to finish the bill before the July 4th recess. We'll have more live Senate coverage tomorrow here on C-SPAN 2. We talk with a reporter about a bill to ban